Each year, environmental researchers studying the long-term effects of chemical warfare in Southeast Asia document water sources that display properties defying conventional chemistry and hydrology, behaving in ways that suggest consciousness or intent rather than simple contamination by toxic compounds. It occurs so frequently in regions heavily sprayed with defoliants during the Vietnam War that the Vietnamese government maintains a classified database containing over 800 documented cases of what are euphemistically termed anomalous aquatic phenomena, ranging from water that flows uphill against gravity to rivers that display apparent awareness of human presence and demonstrate what can only be described as predatory behavior toward those who approach their banks. The Vietnam War, which claimed over 58,000 American lives and an estimated 3 million Vietnamese casualties between 1955 and 1975, created environmental conditions so extreme, through the deliberate poisoning of over 5 million acres of forest and cropland with Agent Orange and other herbicides, that the boundary between chemical contamination and something far more sinister became impossible to distinguish, especially in the Mekong Delta region where water, earth, and death mixed together in concentrations that transformed entire ecosystems into something that bore only superficial resemblance to natural wetlands. Landing Zone Reaper, designated as LZ-447 in official military communications, was established in late May 1969, approximately 40 kilometers southwest of Can Tho, in the heart of the Mekong Delta's mangrove swamps, positioned to provide helicopter support for river patrol operations and serving as a forward staging area for the 9th Infantry Division's efforts to interdict Viet Cong supply routes through waterways so complex and interconnected that maps became obsolete within weeks of being drawn as channels shifted and new routes emerged through vegetation so thick it could swallow entire platoons without leaving any trace of their passage. But for the 95 soldiers of Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 47th Infantry Regiment, who were assigned to secure this remote outpost, surrounded on all sides by black water that stank of chemicals and death, the real enemy wouldn't emerge from the jungle or attack from sampans moving silently through morning fog, but rather would rise from the contaminated swamp itself, a liquid presence that had been feeding on Agent Orange and Vietnamese blood for years, before American boots ever touched this cursed ground, waiting with patient hunger for the moment when it would have access to fresh meat and new memories to absorb into its ever-expanding consciousness that was simultaneously one entity and thousands of fragmented souls all screaming together in a voice made of water and dissolved flesh. What exactly happened at Landing Zone Reaper during the monsoon season of 1969? And why did an entire company of American soldiers vanish so completely that even their dog tags and weapons were never recovered, as if the swamp itself had opened up and swallowed them whole, leaving behind nothing but a landing zone designation that would be struck from all maps and erased from official records, as if those 95 men had never existed at all? The Mekong Delta region of southern Vietnam encompasses over 40,000 square kilometers of the most complex wetland ecosystem in Southeast Asia, where the Mekong River branches into thousands of distributaries, creating a maze of channels, canals, rice paddies, and mangrove forests so interconnected that the boundary between land and water becomes meaningless, with soil so saturated it can swallow a man whole, and water so shallow it can hide entire enemy battalions, moving silently through vegetation thick enough to block sunlight even at midday. The region produces over half of Vietnam's rice crop and has supported human civilization for thousands of years, but it also carries a darker legacy as a graveyard for successive armies who underestimated the Delta's ability to consume foreign invaders, from Chinese forces during medieval conflicts to French colonial troops during the First Indochina War, who reported entire companies disappearing into swamps and never emerging, their fates attributed to Viet Minh ambushes, but which local Vietnamese whispered were actually claimed by something far older than any human conflict. The water itself possesses a distinctive black color that Western observers initially assumed came from tannins leaching from mangrove roots, but which Vietnamese fishermen had always known carried a more sinister origin, describing the darkness as nuoc ma, ghost water, that appeared in areas where too many people had died, and their blood had mixed with soil and water until the swamp developed a taste for human flesh and began actively hunting for more. As is common throughout Vietnam, the spiritual significance of water in the Mekong Delta extends back long before French colonialism or American intervention brought modern weapons to an ancient landscape that operated according to rules outsiders never bothered to learn or respect. Vietnamese folklore speaks of Than Nuoc, water spirits, that inhabit rivers and swamps, entities that can appear as beautiful women to lure men to drowning deaths, or manifest as serpents made of liquid that drag victims beneath the surface to feed on their life force. With Buddhist monks performing regular ceremonies at the banks of particularly dangerous waterways to appease these spirits and maintain tenuous peace between human communities and whatever consciousness inhabited the depths. Colonialism or American intervention brought modern weapons to an ancient landscape that operated according to rules outsiders never bothered to learn or respect. Vietnamese folklore speaks of Than Nuoc, water spirits, that inhabit rivers and swamps, entities that can appear as beautiful women to lure men to drowning deaths, or manifest as serpents made of liquid that drag victims beneath the surface to feed on their life force. With Buddhist monks performing regular ceremonies at the banks of particularly dangerous waterways to appease these spirits and maintain tenuous peace between human communities and whatever consciousness inhabited the depths. These weren't dismissed as mere superstition by the Vietnamese who had lived alongside the delta's waters for generations, but rather treated as practical knowledge equivalent to understanding which snakes were venomous or which plants were edible, with specific protocols for how to cross certain channels, what offerings to leave before drawing water from particular sources, and most importantly, what signs indicated a body of water had become corrupted beyond any hope of spiritual cleansing and needed to be permanently avoided regardless of tactical or agricultural advantages it might offer. French military records from the 1940s and 1950s contain dozens of reports describing incidents where colonial troops operating in the Delta experienced mass casualties attributed officially to disease or enemy action, but which unit journals described in more disturbing terms. Entire squads found drowned in water, barely knee-deep bodies showing signs of having been held underwater by force far greater than any human could exert, with skin displaying chemical burns that matched no known weapon, and lungs filled with black liquid that shouldn't have been possible if the victims had simply drowned in river water. The Americans inherited these cursed waterways when they established their presence in the Mekong Delta during the mid-1960s, but unlike the French, who had at least attempted to learn from Vietnamese warnings about spiritually dangerous locations, U.S. military planners approached the region as a tactical problem to be solved through superior firepower and chemical defoliation, rather than a living ecosystem that might respond unpredictably to being poisoned on an industrial scale. Operation Ranch Hand, the massive aerial spraying campaign that dumped over 20 million gallons of herbicides across Vietnam between 1962 and 1971, concentrated particularly heavily in the Mekong Delta, where dense vegetation provided cover for Viet Cong operations, with C-123 aircraft making repeated passes over the same areas until the mangrove forest died and the rice paddies turned into toxic wastelands where nothing would grow for decades after the war ended. What the military strategists didn't anticipate, and what Vietnamese civilians tried desperately to warn about through interpreters who dismissed their concerns as primitive superstition, was that Agent Orange and the other chemical cocktails being sprayed weren't just killing plants, but were fundamentally altering the spiritual properties of the water itself, breaking down whatever natural barriers had kept the Than Nuoc contained, and relatively passive feeding these entities with toxic compounds that enhanced their power, while simultaneously driving them mad with a hunger that no amount of offerings or ceremonies could satisfy anymore. By 1969, when Landing Zone Reaper was established in an area that had been sprayed so heavily, the trees stood as white skeletons, and the water had turned from its natural brown to an unnatural black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The local Vietnamese had already abandoned the region entirely, leaving behind villages and rice paddies that should have been valuable real estate, but which they treated as cursed ground, where the water itself had become conscious and malevolent, hunting for victims to drag beneath its surface and absorb into a liquid consciousness that grew stronger with each life it consumed. On the morning of June 12, 1969, at approximately 0630 hours, First Lieutenant Robert Swamp Rat Keller, a 26-year-old platoon leader from Louisiana, whose nickname came from his experience navigating bayou terrain that made him uniquely suited for operations in the Mekong. Delta's treacherous waterways stood on the hastily constructed wooden platform that served as Landing Zone Reaper's command post, and watched the morning fog roll across the black water that surrounded their position on three sides like a horseshoe of liquid darkness. The LZ had been operational for only 2 weeks, carved out of mangrove swamp, through brutal labor that required engineers to drive steel pilings deep into saturated soil and construct elevated platforms because the ground itself was too waterlogged to support structures, creating an artificial island approximately 200 meters across that rose barely 1 meter above water level, and which felt less like a military installation and more like a collection of wooden rafts tied together and surrounded by an ecosystem that seemed to actively resent their presence. Sergeant George Doc Thompson, a 28-year-old combat medic from Chicago who had served 2 previous tours and who carried both standard medical supplies and an extensive collection of anti-malarial drugs, antibiotics, and antifungals necessary for treating the infections and diseases that thrived in the Delta's humid environment, joined Keller on the platform and made an observation that would prove prophetically disturbing. The water surrounding LZ Reaper, which should have been flowing southward toward the South China Sea, following the natural drainage patterns of the Mekong Delta, appeared to be completely still, despite the fact that tidal charts indicated this should have been a period of active current, creating an eerie mirror-like surface that reflected the gray morning sky with such perfect clarity, it became difficult to determine where water ended and air began. The first undeniable sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the water came during a routine patrol conducted by Staff Sergeant William Gator Jackson's squad at approximately 07:45 hours, when they took their small motorboat approximately 500 meters from the LZ to inspect an abandoned Vietnamese village that intelligence had suggested might be serving as a Viet Cong supply cache, requiring investigation and potential destruction if enemy materials were discovered. As the boat moved through water that was significantly warmer than ambient temperature despite the early morning hour, Private First Class Danny Catfish Evans, a 20-year-old rifleman from Texas who had grown up fishing in the Gulf of Mexico and who possessed an instinctive understanding of how water should behave under various conditions, noticed that their boat's wake wasn't dispersing naturally, but rather seemed to be following behind them like a trail that remained visible far longer than normal physics would allow. The disturbed water maintaining its pattern for over a minute after they passed, rather than smoothing out within seconds as it should have done. More disturbing was the sensation several squad members reported of something large moving beneath the boat. Not the intermittent bumps that would indicate a large fish or submerged log, but rather a continuous presence that seemed to be pacing them, matching their speed and direction, as if the water itself was tracking their movement and maintaining awareness of their position relative to the landing zone they had departed from minutes earlier. When Sergeant Jackson's squad reached the abandoned village and began their search of the elevated wooden structures that rose on stilts above water that had flooded what had once been rice paddies, they discovered evidence that made the hair on every soldier's neck stand up, despite the oppressive heat that was already building as the morning sun burned through the fog. The village hadn't been abandoned due to war or forced relocation as intelligence had suggested, but rather appeared to have been evacuated in desperate haste, with personal belongings still in place, cooking pots still hanging over cold fire pits, and most disturbingly, Buddhist prayer altars that had been positioned at every entrance facing toward the water, rather than the traditional orientation toward ancestral shrines with offerings of rice and incense that had been left so recently they couldn't have been more than a few days old, despite the fact that no Vietnamese civilians had been reported in this area for over 6 months. The prayers, written on paper strips attached to the altars, were translated later by Kit Carson scout Nguyen Van Than, a former Viet Cong soldier who had defected to work with American forces, and his translation made it clear these weren't prayers for protection from American or enemy soldiers, but rather desperate pleas addressed to Than Nuach, begging the water spirit to be satisfied with past offerings and to leave the remaining villagers alone, and with the final prayer dated just 3 days before the Americans arrived, describing how the Blackwater has taken 7 more of our people, dragging them down while they slept, and we can hear their voices calling from beneath the surface asking us to join them, But we know those aren't our family members speaking anymore. It's the hungry water using their memories to lure more victims. Private Evans made the fatal mistake of kneeling at the edge of one of the village's platforms to fill his canteen with water that would be purified with iodine tablets before drinking, being a routine procedure that every soldier performed dozens of times during operations in the Delta, where resupply was irregular and local water sources were essential for maintaining hydration in the brutal Vietnamese heat. The moment his hand touched the black water's surface, he jerked back with a yelp of pain, describing the sensation as being grabbed by something with a grip that felt simultaneously soft like mud and strong like steel cables, fingers or tendrils, or something that definitely possessed intention and strength, wrapping around his wrist for perhaps 2 seconds before he managed to yank his arm free with enough force that he fell backward onto the platform. When Sergeant Jackson and the squad's medic, Corporal Lisa Angel Jones from San Francisco, examined Evans's wrist, they found marks that defied easy explanation. Not bruises or cuts or any injury that would result from grabbing a submerged branch or touching a sharp object, but rather chemical burns in a pattern that clearly showed the outline of 5 distinct grip points matching the spacing of human fingers. Except the burns went deep enough to raise blisters immediately, and the skin around the marks had taken on a grayish discoloration that spread visibly as they watched creeping up Evans's forearm, like an infection moving through his bloodstream at a rate that no known pathogen could achieve. The situation escalated from mysterious to terrifying when Evans began describing sensations that had no medical explanation, claiming he could feel water moving inside his arm despite the fact that the wound was external and there was no entry point where liquid could have entered his body. He described it as a cold presence flowing through his veins, moving toward his heart and carrying with it fragmentary images and emotions that weren't his own. Memories of drowning, of being held underwater while lungs burned and consciousness faded, of dissolving into liquid and becoming part of something vast and hungry that existed as both individual awareness and collective consciousness. Thousands of voices all screaming and whispering simultaneously in languages ranging from Vietnamese to French to something older that had no human words. Doc Jones attempted to treat the injury with standard protocols for chemical burns, irrigating the wound with sterile saline and applying antibiotic ointment. But the grayish discoloration continued spreading despite treatment, and more alarmingly, Evans's body temperature began dropping rapidly, falling from his normal 37 degrees Celsius to 34 degrees within 10 minutes, inducing shivering and confusion that suggested hypothermia despite the fact that the ambient temperature was over 30 degrees, and rising as the morning progressed toward midday heat that regularly exceeded 38 degrees in the Vietnamese Delta. Sergeant Jackson made the immediate decision to abort the patrol and return to LZ Reaper for evacuation of Evans to a field hospital where his inexplicable symptoms could be properly diagnosed and treated by doctors with access to laboratory equipment and pharmaceutical resources beyond what a combat medic could carry in a standard aid bag. But as the squad loaded back into their boat and began the return journey to the landing zone, they discovered that the water had changed in ways that violated every principle of hydrology and fluid dynamics that should have governed the behavior of a river system flowing through a delta toward the ocean. The channels they had navigated easily on their outbound trip now flowed in the opposite direction, not with the gentle shift that would indicate tidal changes, but rather with a strong current that seemed to be actively pushing their boat away from LZ Reaper, forcing Jackson to gun the outboard motor to full throttle, just to make minimal forward progress against water that moved with apparent purpose and determination to prevent their return. More disturbingly, the black water around their boat had begun forming shapes that looked disturbingly like human hands and faces, pressing up from beneath the surface, reaching toward the vessel's sides while mouths made of liquid opened and closed as if trying to speak, or perhaps to breathe air, after being submerged for so long that drowning had become their permanent state of existence. Private Evans's condition deteriorated rapidly during the return journey, his body temperature continuing to drop while the grayish discoloration spread past his elbow toward his shoulder, and he began speaking in voices that alternated between his familiar Texas drawl and other accents and languages he couldn't possibly have known, reciting names and service numbers of soldiers from different units and different time periods, including French colonial troops from the 1940s, and even what Kit Carson Scout Than identified as Vietnamese phrases used during the Japanese occupation of World War II as if Evans was somehow accessing memories that belonged to people who had died in this water decades before he was even born. The most chilling moment came when Evans's voice suddenly changed to perfect English with a Louisiana accent that exactly matched Lieutenant Keller's regional speech patterns, and he began describing details about Keller's childhood in Baton Rouge that no one except the lieutenant could have known. Intimate memories of fishing in the bayou with his father, and the specific phrases his father used to warn him about water moccasins and alligators. Except Evans's borrowed voice twisted these memories into warnings about water that thinks, and rivers that remember everyone who ever drowned in them, and the black liquid that never stops being hungry no matter how many bodies it dissolves and absorbs into its consciousness. Lieutenant Keller's Louisiana upbringing had taught him to respect water in ways that soldiers from other regions couldn't fully appreciate, understanding instinctively that swamps and bayous operated according to rules that differed from rivers or lakes, possessing their own rhythms and dangers that required knowledge passed down through generations of people who had learned to coexist with environments that killed outsiders who approached them with arrogance or ignorance. But as he watched Sergeant Jackson's boat finally struggle back to LZ Reaper, after a return journey that should have taken 15 minutes, but which consumed over an hour of fighting against currents that defied natural hydrodynamics, Keller's experience provided no framework for understanding water that actively resisted movement, that formed shapes suggesting conscious awareness, and that seemed capable of transmitting memories from the dead into the living through nothing more than brief physical contact. His first instinct was to evacuate Evans immediately, via medevac helicopter to the 24th Evacuation Hospital in Long Bin, where his bizarre symptoms could be examined by doctors with access to laboratory equipment and specialists in tropical diseases. But when he radioed for emergency extraction, the response from division headquarters was brutally pragmatic. Monsoon weather was closing in fast, with tropical storm warnings indicating that helicopter operations would be impossible within the next 6 hours, and unlikely to resume for potentially 3 to 5 days depending on storm intensity, meaning Evans would need to be treated at LZ Reaper, using whatever resources Doc Thompson could improvise from standard combat medical supplies, supplemented by whatever pharmaceutical compounds might be requisitioned from other units operating in the region. The breakthrough in understanding what they were actually facing came from an unexpected source that Lieutenant Keller had initially been reluctant to trust. Kit Carson scout Nguyen Van Than, whose service as a former Viet Cong soldier made some American personnel suspicious of his loyalty, despite the fact that he had defected voluntarily and had provided valuable intelligence that saved numerous American lives during his 8 months working with the 9th Infantry Division. When Than heard the description of Evans' symptoms and learned about the prayer altars found in the abandoned village, his reaction was immediate and visceral, backing away from the area where Evans was being treated while making protective gestures and speaking rapid Vietnamese that the unit's interpreter struggled to translate because Than was using regional dialect mixed with terminology that had spiritual rather than literal meanings. Once calmed enough to communicate clearly, Than explained through the interpreter that what had grabbed Evans wasn't a spirit or demon in the traditional sense that American soldiers might understand from their own religious frameworks, but rather something the Vietnamese called Nua Cang Nguoi, water people, entities that had once been human but which had been absorbed into contaminated waterways after drowning or being killed near rivers that had been cursed through accumulated violence and chemical poisoning that broke down the natural barriers between living flesh and liquid matter. According to Than's explanation, which combined Buddhist cosmology with animist beliefs that predated organized religion in Vietnam, human consciousness normally departed the body at death to be reincarnated or to join ancestors in the spirit world. But certain types of traumatic death in spiritually corrupted locations could trap consciousness in the physical matter where the person died, binding their awareness to earth or water or trees in ways that prevented normal spiritual progression. The Mekong Delta had always contained some water people victims of drowning or murder, whose spirits became bound to the rivers and canals where they died. But these entities had traditionally been relatively weak and passive, requiring elaborate ceremonies and specific conditions to manifest any influence over the living world. What changed everything, according to Thang's understanding passed down from village elders and Buddhist monks who maintained oral histories of spiritual dangers in the region, was the introduction of chemical defoliants on a scale so massive it fundamentally altered the spiritual properties of the water itself, creating conditions where the boundaries between consciousness and matter became permeable in ways that allowed the accumulated awareness of thousands of drowning victims to merge into a collective entity that possessed both individual memories and unified purpose, a liquid intelligence that grew stronger with each new death, and which had developed an insatiable hunger to experience physical sensation through stolen bodies and absorbed memories. Because pure spirit existence lacked the richness of embodied awareness that humans took for granted until they lost it forever. What made Than's account particularly credible despite its supernatural elements was his detailed knowledge of previous encounters with water people that matched patterns emerging at LZ Reaper with disturbing accuracy, including the progressive coldness affecting victims who made contact with corrupted water, the spreading discoloration that indicated transformation from solid flesh into something that existed partially as liquid, and most significantly, the ability of affected individuals to access memories belonging to previous victims who had been absorbed into the collective consciousness that inhabited the black water. Thun described an incident from his time with the Viet Cong in 1967 when an entire squad of fighters had been lost to contaminated water in the U Minh forest. Their bodies found days later still standing waist-deep in a canal with skin turned gray and internal organs liquefied, but with lungs somehow still functioning enough to allow them to speak in voices that belonged to French soldiers who had died 20 years earlier, reciting names and unit designations, and begging in French for help that could never come, because the original consciousness had long since been dissolved and absorbed into something that wore their memories like clothing borrowed from corpses. According to Thanh, traditional Vietnamese methods for dealing with water people involved either complete avoidance of affected areas, or in extreme cases, extensive purification rituals performed by Buddhist monks who possessed knowledge of specific prayers and offerings that could temporarily calm the entities and prevent them from actively hunting new victims, though such measures were always temporary because the fundamental corruption remained and would eventually reassert itself once the protective ceremonies lost their potency. The second major incident that confirmed Than's warnings and demonstrated that the situation was deteriorating far more rapidly than anyone had anticipated occurred at approximately 1445 hours on June 12th, when the monsoon rains finally arrived with tropical intensity that reduced visibility to less than 20 meters and transformed LZ Reaper into an island besieged by water that rose steadily as the storm dumped what would eventually measure as over 180 millimeters of rainfall in less than 6 hours. Private Evans's condition had progressed to the point where the gray discoloration covered his entire right arm and had begun spreading across his chest toward his heart. His body temperature had dropped to 32 degrees Celsius, despite being wrapped in every blanket available, and he had stopped speaking in his own voice entirely, instead cycling through dozens of different accents and languages, while reciting fragmentary memories that seemed to span decades of Vietnamese history, from Japanese occupation forces in the 1940s, to French Foreign Legion troops in the 1950s, to Viet Cong fighters in the 1960s, all of them united by the common experience of dying in water that wouldn't allow them to stay dead or move on to whatever afterlife their various religions had promised. But Evans wasn't the only soldier experiencing symptoms anymore. 3 additional members of Sergeant Jackson's squad who had been in the boat during the patrol began reporting the same initial signs of contamination, complaining of cold sensations in their extremities despite the tropical heat, showing early stages of the grayish discoloration on hands and feet, and most disturbingly, beginning to hear voices speaking Vietnamese and French inside their heads, intrusive thoughts that felt foreign and hostile, as if other consciousnesses were attempting to establish footholds in their minds and push out their original personalities to make room for the accumulated awareness of the water people who wanted desperately to experience physical embodiment again, even if it meant sharing space with a host consciousness that fought against the invasion. The water surrounding LZ Reaper rose to unprecedented levels during the monsoon downpour, approaching the elevated platforms that should have been safe from even extreme flooding based on engineering calculations and historical water level data. but which now found themselves barely half a meter above a surface that churned and roiled with movement that couldn't be explained by wind or current alone. Soldiers on perimeter guard reported seeing faces in the water, dozens of them pressing up from below like drowning victims trying to break the surface for one final breath. Except these faces weren't struggling or panicked, but rather displayed expressions of patient observation, watching the Americans with eyes made of liquid darkness that tracked individual soldiers as they moved around the landing zone. More terrifying were the hands that began emerging from the water after darkness fell, not solid appendages of flesh and bone, but rather extensions of the black liquid itself that maintained humanoid shape through some property that had nothing to do with surface tension or normal fluid dynamics, reaching upward toward the platforms as if measuring the distance that separated the water people from their desired prey, and calculating how much higher the monsoon needed to raise the water level before that gap closed completely and allowed them to drag soldiers down into liquid dissolution that would add American memories and American bodies to the collective consciousness that had been feeding on death and Agent Orange for years while waiting for an opportunity exactly like this. Lieutenant Keller made a desperate decision that violated standard military protocol, but which represented the only hope for preventing LZ Reaper from becoming a mass grave that would swallow his entire company without leaving any evidence of what had actually killed them, calling a formation of all soldiers who remained uncontaminated and explaining with brutal honesty that they were facing a threat that conventional weapons and tactics couldn't address, that the water surrounding them had become actively hostile and was attempting to absorb them into some kind of collective entity that previous victims couldn't adequately describe, because human language lacked vocabulary for the horror of having your consciousness dissolved and merged with thousands of others, while your body liquefied and became indistinguishable from the swamp that had consumed you. Keller's pragmatic Louisiana sensibility recognized that sometimes survival required accepting uncomfortable truths and adapting to threats that textbooks and training manuals never addressed, telling his soldiers that they needed to listen to Thun's advice about how Vietnamese communities had historically dealt with water people, even if those methods involved spiritual practices that made American soldiers uncomfortable, because their alternative was drowning in water that would keep them conscious and aware while it dissolved their flesh and absorbed their memories into a liquid intelligence that had already demonstrated its ability to use stolen knowledge against the living. The complete breakdown of LZ Reaper's defensive integrity began at precisely 1847 hours on June 12th, when the rising water finally reached the level of the elevated platforms and began flowing across the wooden surfaces that had been constructed specifically to keep American soldiers above the flood levels that regularly inundated the Mekong Delta during monsoon season. Except the engineering calculations had assumed they were dealing with normal hydrology rather than liquid that possessed intention and the ability to defy gravity when sufficiently motivated by hunger for new victims to absorb into its ever-expanding collective consciousness. Lieutenant Keller watched in horror as the black water didn't simply lap at the edges of the platforms the way normal flooding would, but rather flowed upward in defiance of basic physics, climbing the support pilings like a serpent ascending a tree, moving with visible purpose and coordination that made it clear this wasn't random overflow, but rather a coordinated assault by an intelligence that had been studying LZ Reaper's layout and waiting for the moment when monsoon rains would provide enough additional volume to allow it to breach defenses that had been designed to protect against conventional flooding rather than liquid that could reshape itself according to need. The water spread across the platform surfaces in patterns that seemed designed to herd soldiers away from the center of the landing zone toward the edges where they would be more vulnerable to being pulled over the side, flowing in channels that divided groups and isolated individuals, creating pools that rose impossibly high in localized areas while remaining shallow in others, demonstrating a level of tactical awareness that suggested the water people collective had learned strategy by absorbing memories from decades of soldiers who had drowned in these channels and whose military training now served the entity that had consumed them. Private First Class Evans, whose transformation from solid human to something predominantly liquid had progressed to the point where over 60% of his body mass showed the gray discoloration indicating conversion to water, people matter, suddenly rose from the stretcher where Doc Thompson had been monitoring his deteriorating vital signs, and began moving with mechanical precision toward the platform's edge. His eyes now completely black like pools of the contaminated water itself, and his mouth opening to release voices that belonged to dozens of different people speaking simultaneously in a chorus that combined English, Vietnamese, French, and languages so old that even Kit Carson Scout Than couldn't identify them. Evans's borrowed voices spoke with disturbing coherence despite coming from multiple sources explaining in matter-of-fact tones what was happening to him and what would soon happen to everyone at LZ Reaper. The dissolution is beautiful once you stop fighting it. Your individuality was always an illusion anyway. We are all just water temporarily organized into patterns that think they're separate. Agent Orange broke down the barriers that kept us apart. Now we flow together, sharing everything, every memory, every sensation. The Vietnamese grandmother who drowned in 1954 is here with us. The French captain who was ambushed in 1949 is here. The American pilot who crashed in the swamp last year is here. And soon you will all be here too, adding your memories to ours, your training, your knowledge of weapons and tactics. We've learned so much from the ones who came before you, and we're so hungry for more. The contaminated soldiers who had been showing early symptoms of transformation suddenly accelerated into advanced stages as the water made contact with the platform and created a direct connection between the liquid matter in their bloodstreams and the larger consciousness that inhabited the swamp around them. Their bodies beginning to liquefy visibly as skin took on a translucent quality that revealed circulatory systems filling with black fluid that pulsed in rhythm with the waves lapping at the platform's edges, rather than following normal heartbeat patterns. Specialist Robert Bones Williams, a 22-year-old radio operator from Tennessee, who had touched the water while trying to secure equipment during the rising flood, collapsed, screaming, as his left arm literally began dripping away in thick rivulets that flowed across the wooden planks toward the nearest pool of accumulated water, his solid matter converting to liquid so rapidly that Doc Thompson could actually watch muscle and bone dissolving into a black substance that maintained enough cohesion to flow in specific directions rather than simply spreading out according to gravity. Williams retained enough consciousness during his transformation to describe the experience in horrifying detail, his voice alternating between his own Tennessee accent and the borrowed tones of previous victims whose awareness he was joining. I can feel them, all of them, in my head. They're not taking over. They're mixing with me. My memories of home are bleeding into someone else's memories of a rice paddy. I can't tell anymore where I end and they begin. Oh God, it doesn't hurt. That's the worst part. It feels good, like finally belonging to something bigger. Like every lonely moment I ever experienced was just practice for this perfect union. Please, kill me before I stop wanting you to. The water surrounding LZ Reaper began manifesting physical forms with increasing solidity and complexity. No longer just hands and faces pressing up from below, but rather complete humanoid shapes rising from the surface and standing on top of the liquid, as if it had become solid ground. Dozens of figures that combined characteristics from all the different victims the collective had absorbed over the years: Vietnamese civilians wearing French colonial uniforms, American soldiers with Asian facial features, children merged with elderly forms, creating grotesque hybrids that defied any normal conception of human anatomy. These water people moved with coordinated precision toward the platforms, reaching out with appendages that shifted between solid and liquid states, depending on what functionality they required, solidifying into grasping hands when they needed to grab, or pull, liquefying into flowing tendrils when they needed to seep through cracks or wrap around obstacles, demonstrating an adaptability that made them nearly impossible to defend against using conventional military tactics or weapons. Several soldiers attempted to open fire on the approaching water people, but bullets passed through the liquid forms without causing any apparent damage, the entities simply allowing their bodies to become temporarily less cohesive to let projectiles pass through before reforming on the other side of the impact point, their borrowed voices explaining in patient tones, "You can't kill what's already dead. You can't destroy what doesn't have organs or bones to break. We're just water organized by consciousness, and consciousness can't be shot. It can only be absorbed, joined, merged into something greater than any individual existence." Lieutenant Keller realized with growing horror that the water people weren't just attempting to capture individual soldiers, but rather were working systematically to cut off all possible escape routes from LZ Reaper, surrounding the landing zone completely while other entities began dismantling the communication equipment and destroying anything that might allow the Americans to call for help or document what was happening to them before they were absorbed into the collective consciousness that hungered for their memories and their bodies. The radio antennas collapsed as water people in the form of children climbed the metal structures with impossible agility, their liquid bodies flowing around support cables and pulling with strength that exceeded anything their apparent size should have allowed, bringing the communication array crashing down into the floodwaters where it disappeared beneath the surface and presumably was being carried away to prevent any repair or recovery. The boats that had been tied to the platform's edges were filling with water that flowed upward from below rather than down from the rain, the hulls cracking and splitting as liquid forced its way through seams that should have been watertight, creating conditions where even if some soldiers managed to reach the vessels, they would find them unserviceable and useless for any evacuation attempt that required traveling across water that was actively hostile and which controlled every channel and canal leading away from the landing zone toward potential safety. The climax of the supernatural assault came when Private Evans, whose transformation was now complete with his body composed of perhaps 90% water people matter and only 10% remaining original flesh, walked calmly to the platform's edge and simply stepped off into the black water that rose up to embrace him like a lover, welcoming home someone who had been absent far too long, his form dissolving into the liquid and spreading out in ripples that carried his consciousness away, to join the vast collective that inhabited every contaminated waterway throughout the Mekong Delta. But Evans didn't simply disappear into the water and cease to exist as an individual. Instead, his awareness became distributed throughout the liquid mass surrounding LZ Reaper, allowing him to speak from multiple locations simultaneously, his voice emerging from a dozen different water people forms that had risen from the swamp, and which now used his recent memories to taunt the soldiers he had served with just hours earlier. "Lieutenant Keller, sir, I can see your thoughts reflected in the water's surface. You're thinking about that time in Louisiana, when you almost drowned in the bayou and your daddy pulled you out. You were 7 years old and you thought you were going to die. Well, now I understand what death really is. It's not an ending. It's just a change in state, from solid to liquid, from individual to collective. And you're all going to understand soon, too. The water is rising. It always rises. And when it touches you, when it flows into your mouth and your nose and mixes with your blood, you'll finally know what it means to truly belong to something." Kit Carson Scout Than, who had been consulting with Lieutenant Keller about traditional Vietnamese methods for dealing with water people, made a desperate suggestion that represented their only remaining option for survival. According to Buddhist traditions and folk wisdom, passed down through generations of Vietnamese who had learned to coexist with spiritually dangerous waterways, the Water People Collective could be temporarily driven back or weakened through the use of fire, applied directly to contaminated water in quantities and temperatures sufficient to create steam that would force the liquid consciousness to retreat to protect itself from being boiled away into vapor that couldn't maintain cohesion or awareness. The method was dangerous and had never been attempted on the scale that would be necessary to protect an entire landing zone surrounded by hostile water, requiring the creation of a massive fire barrier using all available fuel sources including diesel for generators, gasoline for vehicles, and potentially even napalm if any was stored at LZ Reaper, creating a ring of flames on the water's surface that would buy time for soldiers to either evacuate by helicopter once the storm cleared, or at minimum, to survive long enough that reinforcements might arrive with resources and knowledge that a single isolated company couldn't access while trapped on an island besieged by liquid death that had been learning how to hunt humans efficiently, ever since Agent Orange began creating the conditions for individual consciousnesses to merge into collective intelligence driven by insatiable hunger for the physical experiences that only embodied existence could provide. Lieutenant Keller's decision to implement Than's desperate fire barrier strategy required him to authorize the use of resources that were technically restricted under military protocols governing the deployment of incendiary weapons in populated areas, But LZ Reaper's isolation and the supernatural nature of the threat made conventional regulations meaningless when compared to the immediate necessity of preventing his remaining soldiers from being dissolved into liquid consciousness that would absorb their memories and military knowledge into a collective entity that grew more dangerous with each victim it consumed. The landing zone's fuel depot contained approximately 800 liters of diesel for generators, 200 liters of gasoline for vehicles and equipment, and most critically, 6 Mark 77 napalm canisters that had been stored at the LZ for potential use in clearing vegetation around the perimeter, but which now represented the only substance capable of creating sustained high-temperature flames on water's surface. Within 15 minutes of making the decision, every soldier who remained uncontaminated and capable of following orders was involved in the frantic effort to position fuel containers around the platform's edges, creating a perimeter that could be ignited simultaneously to establish a ring of fire that would theoretically create enough heat to drive back the black water and the entities that had risen from it to assault the landing zone with intentions that combined predatory hunger with something that might have been loneliness, or the desperate desire for connection that comes from spending decades as fragmented awareness, trapped in liquid isolation, waiting for opportunities to merge with fresh consciousness and experience physical embodiment again, even if only temporarily through stolen bodies. The implementation of the fire barrier began at 1923 hours, just as twilight was fading into full darkness, that made the water people forms even more terrifying because their liquid bodies seemed to generate their own faint bioluminescence, creating an eerie glow that outlined humanoid shapes moving through the floodwaters with predatory patience, while voices that had once belonged to Evans and Williams and the 3 other contaminated soldiers called out to their former comrades, using intimate knowledge of personal histories and private fears to psychologically wear down defensive resolve and create openings for physical attacks that would allow the water people to make contact with uncontaminated flesh and begin the conversion process that would add more victims to the collective consciousness that hungered for growth and expansion beyond the geographical boundaries of this single contaminated swamp. Sergeant Jackson, who had taken over tactical command of the perimeter defense while Lieutenant Keller coordinated the overall strategy, gave the order to ignite the fuel barrier, and within seconds the platform's edges erupted into walls of flame that rose 3 meters high and spread across the water's surface as diesel and gasoline floated on top of the black liquid and burned with intense heat that created immediate steam clouds where fire met water, generating temperatures that exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius in the immediate combustion zone, and which had the desired effect of forcing the water people forms to retreat away from the platform as their liquid bodies began boiling at the edges, the entities releasing screams that combined the voices of all their absorbed victims into a cacophony of agony that suggested whatever consciousness inhabited the contaminated water could still experience something analogous to pain, despite having transcended biological limitations through its transformation into liquid collective awareness. The napalm canisters were deployed as a second defensive layer approximately 20 meters beyond the initial fuel barrier, creating an outer ring of sustained burning that would continue for hours rather than the minutes that standard diesel and gasoline fires would provide before consuming their available fuel and extinguishing themselves. Doc Thompson, working with Specialist Bones Williams, whose arm had been amputated at the shoulder after the tissue liquefaction had progressed too far to reverse, but who remained conscious and determined to help defend his fellow soldiers despite the trauma of having lost a limb to dissolution rather than conventional combat injury, rigged the napalm canisters with timed fuses that would detonate them in sequence, creating a progressive expansion of the fire barrier that would push the further back and buy additional time for the storm to pass and helicopter evacuation to become possible once weather conditions improved enough to allow flight operations in the region. The napalm ignited with characteristic intensity, the jellied gasoline mixture adhering to the water's surface and burning at temperatures that exceeded anything the diesel barrier had achieved, creating a curtain of flame so bright it turned night into day across a 50-meter radius and generated enough heat that soldiers on the platform had to retreat to the center of the landing zone to avoid burns from radiant energy that made the tropical air feel like standing inside an oven, preheated beyond any temperature. Human bodies were designed to tolerate for extended periods, but the fire barrier, while effective at creating temporary protection, came with a horrifying cost that Keller hadn't fully anticipated when he authorized its deployment. The water people who were caught in the outer edges of the flames didn't simply boil away into harmless steam, but rather underwent a transformation that concentrated their consciousness into smaller volumes of liquid that became exponentially more aggressive and focused, as if reducing their physical mass forced the distributed awareness to compress into denser configurations that possessed greater intensity of purpose and hatred toward the soldiers who had inflicted this pain upon them. The voices emanating from the water beyond the fire barrier changed in tone from the earlier attempts at psychological manipulation and promises of peaceful merger into collective existence, becoming instead threats and curses shouted in dozens of languages. Simultaneously, the water people using memories absorbed from French colonial troops to describe in graphic detail the tortures that had been inflicted on Vietnamese resistance fighters during the 1950s, using memories from American soldiers to recite classified information about military operations and strategic plans that should have been secure but which the collective had learned through absorption of personnel who had drowned carrying that knowledge, and most disturbingly using memories from Vietnamese civilians to describe the effects of Agent Orange on pregnant women and children, detailing birth defects and cancers, and genetic damage that would persist for generations, making it clear that the Water People Collective understood exactly what had been done to create the conditions for their existence, and felt something that might have been rage, or might have been grief, for the human lives that had been destroyed to create this liquid consciousness that hadn't asked to exist, but which now possessed an insatiable hunger to experience physical embodiment, regardless of the cost to others. The situation took a devastating turn when the monsoon rains intensified rather than diminishing, as weather forecasts had predicted adding volume to the floodwaters faster than the fire barriers could evaporate it, creating conditions where the water level began rising again, despite the heat being applied, slowly but inexorably encroaching on the platform as the black liquid found paths around the flames, by flowing through underground channels and seeping up through cracks in the wooden planking that had been constructed on steel pilings driven deep into saturated soil that connected to the same water table that fed the swamp surrounding LZ Reaper. Lieutenant Keller watched his fuel supplies diminishing at alarming rates, while the water continued advancing, forcing him to make calculations about how many hours of protection remained before the barriers would fail completely, and the cursed water would have unrestricted access to the landing zone, and the soldiers who had so far managed to avoid contamination, but who would inevitably be overwhelmed once the flames died and left them exposed to liquid consciousness that had spent the past hours being burned and boiled, and which would likely be far less interested in peaceful merger and far more focused on revenge for the pain that fire had inflicted upon entities that hadn't experienced physical suffering since their original deaths years or decades earlier. The breakthrough that ultimately saved the survivors came not from American military ingenuity or tactics, but from Kit Carson Scout Than's knowledge of Vietnamese spiritual practices and her willingness to perform a ceremony that would cost her her life in exchange for creating conditions that might allow the soldiers to escape. Than explained through the interpreter that traditional Buddhist methods for dealing with malevolent water spirits involved offering them a willing sacrifice, someone who would voluntarily enter the contaminated water and allow their consciousness to be absorbed into the collective, but who would carry with them specific prayers and mantras that acted as spiritual poison, contaminating the water people's unified awareness with concepts and intentions that would create internal conflict and temporary confusion that disrupted the entity's ability to coordinate attacks or maintain focus on external targets, while it struggled to process and integrate information that operated according to religious logic, rather than the hunger-driven purpose that had motivated all its previous actions. Than made clear that this wasn't superstition or primitive magic, but rather a practical application of psychological warfare adapted to fight an enemy composed of consciousness rather than flesh, using the Water People Collective's own nature against itself, by introducing thoughts and beliefs that would spread through the distributed awareness, like a virus infecting a computer network, creating enough chaos and internal discord that the entity would be forced to turn its attention inward, rather than continuing its assault on the soldiers who represented potential new victims and sources of fresh memories and physical embodiment. The official military report filed by Colonel James Bradford, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion 47th Infantry Regiment, regarding the incident at Landing Zone Reaper, classified the entire event as catastrophic flooding during monsoon season, resulting in mass casualties from drowning and exposure, complicated by tropical disease outbreak and chemical contamination from ruptured fuel storage. And within 72 hours of the survivors' evacuation by helicopter, once weather conditions improved on June 15th, every remaining member of Alpha Company who hadn't been absorbed into the cursed water had been dispersed to different medical facilities across 3 continents under quarantine protocols that prevented them from communicating with each other or discussing what had actually occurred during those 72 hours when they had been besieged by liquid consciousness that fed on Agent Orange and human memories. The official casualty list recorded 48 soldiers as killed in action during enemy contact, 23 as died from drowning during flood emergency, and 11 as missing in action, presumed dead, with no mention made of the fact that these 82 individuals hadn't been killed by Viet Cong forces or natural disaster, but had rather been absorbed into contaminated water that dissolved their bodies and merged their consciousnesses into a collective entity that continued to inhabit the Mekong Delta's waterways long after the war ended and American forces withdrew from Vietnam. Kit Carson Scout Nguyen Van Thon was listed simply as local national employee killed during combat operations. A single line in a casualty report that gave no indication he had voluntarily sacrificed himself by walking into the black water. Landing Zone Reaper was officially abandoned on June 16, 1969, with combat engineers placing demolition charges that destroyed the elevated platforms and collapsed the steel pilings into the contaminated swamp, ensuring that no future American personnel would attempt to re-establish a presence in an area that had proven catastrophically dangerous for reasons that couldn't be explained in any official documentation or tactical analysis. The Vietnamese government, following the war's conclusion in 1975, designated the entire region surrounding the former LZ Reaper as a permanent exclusion zone prohibiting civilian settlement or agricultural activity, and posting guards with orders to prevent anyone from approaching water sources that continued to display anomalous properties, decades after Agent Orange spraying had officially ceased, with local communities maintaining oral traditions about Nuoc Ngoy that inhabited certain channels and rice paddies where too many people had died, and where the boundary between individual consciousness and liquid matter had become dangerously permeable. Satellite imagery from environmental monitoring programs tracking Agent Orange contamination in Vietnam shows a distinctive circular area approximately 2 kilometers in diameter, centered on the former LZ Reaper location, where water remains discolored and where vegetation refuses to grow along the banks despite decades of natural recovery in surrounding regions, as if the soil and water in that specific location had been so fundamentally altered by the combination of chemical contamination and accumulated death that they could no longer support normal biological processes or maintain the natural boundaries that separated living matter from its environment. Lieutenant Robert Keller was promoted to captain and transferred to a training command position at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he spent the next 20 years teaching jungle warfare tactics to infantry officers, while carefully editing his experiences to exclude any mention of threats that operated outside conventional military paradigms. His Louisiana background and respect for swamp ecology informing his instruction, but his knowledge of water that could think and hunt and dissolve human bodies into liquid consciousness, remaining locked behind classified briefings that even most general officers weren't authorized to access. Sergeant George Thompson, the combat medic who had watched helplessly as soldiers under his care liquefied, despite all his medical training and pharmaceutical resources, left the Army in 1971 and spent 3 decades working in tropical disease research, publishing papers on the long-term health effects of Agent Orange exposure, while privately investigating reports from Vietnamese medical facilities about patients who displayed symptoms similar to what he had witnessed at LZ Reaper. Sergeant William Jackson, whose patrol had made first contact with the Water People Collective, never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of watching his squad members transform into liquid entities that used their own memories and voices against him, developing severe aquaphobia that made it impossible for him to shower without experiencing panic attacks, and forcing him to relocate to the desert climate of Arizona, where the absence of standing water provided some relief from constant fear that any liquid he encountered might contain hostile consciousness waiting for an opportunity to absorb him into a collective awareness that had haunted his nightmares for over 50 years. Survivors who were contaminated by contact with the black water, but who were evacuated before the transformation progressed beyond the point of medical intervention, experienced varying degrees of recovery, with most regaining normal body temperature and skin color within weeks of the event. But all of them reported lingering symptoms that suggested their brief connection to distributed consciousness had left permanent psychological scars. Private First Class. Danny Evans's family was told he died from complications related to tropical disease contracted during combat operations. His body returned in a sealed casket with military honors and strict instructions that opening it would violate federal regulations. In 2003, a joint U.S.-Vietnamese team conducting environmental assessment of Agent Orange contamination sites reported discovering a water source near the former LZ Reaper location that displayed temperature anomalies and chemical properties that couldn't be explained through conventional pollution analysis, with samples showing the presence of human DNA from multiple individuals somehow suspended in liquid solution without the cellular structure that normally contains genetic material. The team's report was immediately classified. The samples were confiscated by military authorities, and all personnel involved were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under penalty of prosecution for revealing information that might compromise national security or create public panic about threats that most people couldn't defend against, and which governments had no established protocols for addressing through conventional military or medical intervention. The official story will always maintain that Alpha Company suffered heavy casualties from conventional combat, flooding, and illness during routine operations in a hostile environment, that the 82 soldiers who died at LZ Reaper were victims of enemy action or natural. But somewhere in a classified vault beneath the Pentagon, stored in files that require special authorization that even most flag officers can't access, there exists documentation that tells a different story. Most significantly, that vault contains the final radio transmission from Kit Carson's scout. Nguyen Van Thun recorded moments before he walked into the contaminated water, carrying Buddhist mantras that would act as spiritual poison against an entity composed of hunger and memory. His voice calm and resolved as he explained in Vietnamese that sometimes the only way to fight consciousness is with consciousness, that weapons made of metal and fire could only delay entities made of awareness and intention, and that his sacrifice would buy time for others to escape, but wouldn't permanently destroy what had been created through the combination of chemical contamination and accumulated death in water that refused to forget anyone who had ever drowned in its depths, or whose blood had mixed with Agent Orange in soil, that had learned to hunger for human flesh and human memories, with an appetite that would persist long after the war. Don't forget to follow our channel for more classified military incidents that reveal the true cost of modern warfare and the unintended consequences of chemical weapons that alter environments in ways we don't fully understand. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that challenge everything we think we know about consciousness, death, and the boundaries between individual existence and collective awareness that might emerge in contaminated ecosystems, where accumulated trauma and toxic compounds create conditions for new forms of intelligence that hunger for the physical experiences only embodied beings can provide. And subscribe to join our growing community of truth seekers who understand that the real casualty of war aren't just the soldiers who die on battlefields, but also the environments that become permanently altered by our weapons, and the entities that emerge from poisoned earth and water that has been forced to absorb so much death and suffering that it develops its own awareness and appetite for the living flesh and conscious minds that modern military forces continue to sacrifice without understanding that some battles don't end when soldiers withdraw, some enemies don't die when their bodies are destroyed, and some weapons create threats far more dangerous than the problems they were designed